The thick canopy of the forest stood like an unyielding wall of green, casting the ground below in a dim, almost eerie twilight. Beyond the tangle of undergrowth and towering trees, the remote wildlife sanctuary stretched for miles, untouched by the hands of men. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and vegetation, an unspoken testament to the untamed wild that had flourished here for centuries. Nathan, a seasoned caretaker at the sanctuary, moved quietly through the forest, the soles of his boots sinking into the rich, damp earth. His face was weathered from years of living in isolation, his eyes sharp but calm, the reflection of someone who had learned to understand the subtle language of the forest. As an elephant whisperer, he had built a bond with the creatures he cared for, learning to communicate with them in ways that most humans could never comprehend. Today, however, something felt different. The forest was still, unnaturally so. No birds called from the treetops, no rustling of small mammals stirred in the brush. Even the distant river, usually full of life, was unnervingly silent. Nathan's heart rate quickened ever so slightly as he continued along the path, his senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the environment. He had learned long ago that when the forest grew silent, danger was often near. The elephants, a small herd that Nathan had helped to rehabilitate over the past 5 years, had not returned to their usual feeding grounds by the river. Their absence gnawed at him, the weight of the unexplained silence growing heavier. He knew the forest like the back of his hand, but today it felt foreign, hostile. The wind shifted, a slight whisper in the leaves, and Nathan froze. The hairs on his neck stood on end. It was then that he heard it. A low, distant rumble. It was the unmistakable sound of an elephant's call, but it was wrong. The sound was strained, desperate, and then it faded, swallowed by the dense forest. Nathan's instincts flared. He had to find them. He quickened his pace, slipping through the underbrush, careful not to make a sound. His breath came shallow and steady as his eyes scanned the trees ahead. The path wound through the forest, the dense foliage barely allowing any light to penetrate. For an hour, Nathan pushed forward, his heart pounding louder with each step, the strange quiet of the forest closing in around him. Finally, he came upon a clearing. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. There, in the center, was the herd. Silent, still, their massive bodies frozen in place. They stood in a circle, their trunks raised, as though listening for something, or perhaps warning something away. Nathan's gaze flicked from one elephant to the next. There was something amiss. The youngest of the herd, a calf named Layla, was trembling at the edge of the circle, her eyes wide with fear. Her mother, a powerful matriarch named Amara, stood beside her, but her normally unshakable presence seemed clouded by a sense of unease. The other elephants, usually calm and patient, were tense, their ears flared in alertness. Nathan crouched low, his heartbeat steadying as he studied the herd. He knew this behavior. This was the sign of an impending threat. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. Something was out there, lurking just beyond his vision. A rustle from the far side of the clearing made him stiffen. The elephants stiffened as well, their trunks flaring, eyes darting. It wasn't just one sound, it was multiple. The crackling of branches breaking underfoot, the sound of something large moving in the distance. Nathan held his breath, his pulse quickening. There were other creatures out there, something, or someone, moving in the shadows. Slowly, with deliberate care, Nathan stood and stepped closer to the herd, trying not to disturb their delicate formation. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself, but he trusted in his bond with the elephants. If they sensed danger, he had to know what it was before it was too late. Suddenly, a sharp, jagged cry split the air, a scream that chilled him to his core. The elephants immediately turned, their bodies stiffening as they began to retreat, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. But it was too late. The sound came again, louder this time. a shriek that seemed to reverberate through the ground itself. The herd turned, instinctively heading toward the safety of a dense thicket. But Laylog, the calf, stayed frozen. Nathan's heart sank. He couldn't see what was causing the distress, but he could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of something unseen, something that held them all in place. He stepped forward, reaching out his hand toward Layla, trying to coax her away from the clearing. But then he heard it. A sound like the deep growl of a predator, low and guttural, not from an animal, but from something far worse. A human. A single figure appeared from the shadows, clad in tattered clothing, a silhouette against the thick trees. Nathan's pulse spiked. He recognized the figure immediately. It was Silas, a poacher known for his brutality, someone Nathan had been tracking for weeks. But this was no ordinary poacher. Silas had a reputation for using dark methods. Rumors had circulated that he could control animals, manipulate them through fear. He was the reason the forest had grown so silent, the reason the herd had fled. With a swift motion, Silas raised his arm, and in that instant, the herd of elephants froze, their massive bodies trembling as though caught in a spell. But it wasn't magic, it was fear. The raw instinctual terror that Silas had cultivated over years of cruelty. Nathan's mind raced. He knew Silas's methods all too well, but he couldn't let him take the herd, not after all they had been through. He had spent years forming a bond of trust with them. He had to break this cycle of fear. Silas moved closer, his presence menacing and powerful. The elephants began to move, but only in slow, hesitant steps, as if they were trapped in a dream. Nathan's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't just watch them slip away again. Without thinking, he lunged toward the herd, his voice rising in a guttural shout, a command born from the depths of his connection with the animals. The sound broke the silence, piercing the air like a thunderclap. It was a language Silas could never understand. It was the language of the elephants. In that moment, everything changed. The elephants' fear began to fade, their instincts waking once more. With a single powerful trumpeting call, Amara, the matriarch, took charge. The herd shifted, the tension in their bodies easing. They moved, no longer controlled by the poacher's grip. Silas, momentarily caught off guard, stumbled backward as the herd charged, their immense power crashing through the forest. But it wasn't the poacher's strength that had been broken. It was his control over them. Nathan stood motionless as the herd retreated into the depths of the forest, the ground vibrating beneath their massive feet. The forest, once again alive with the sounds of nature, closed in around him. Silence fell once more, but this time it was the kind of silence that meant victory. Nathan knew the battle wasn't over. Silas would return, and the tension between man and nature would always be there, lingering in the shadows. But for now, the elephants were safe, and as he watched them disappear into the trees, Nathan's heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of peace, an unspoken promise that the bond they shared would endure, no matter the... This story builds suspense by gradually heightening the tension, using the sounds and movements of the environment to create a sense of unease. The twist reveals that the poacher, Silas, isn't just a physical threat, but also uses manipulation and fear to control animals, adding another layer of danger. The story climaxes when Nathan breaks the poacher's hold over the herd, reinforcing the deep, almost mystical connection between humans and the natural world. Nathan stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding as the echoes of the elephant's retreat reverberated through the dense forest. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to breathe with him. He could hear their movements fading into the distance, the heavy, thunderous steps of the herd blending with the rhythm of the wilderness. But the calm was short-lived. The distant crackling of branches snapped his attention back to the present. He wasn't alone. Silas hadn't given up. The poacher would never walk away from a failed hunt without consequences. Nathan knew he couldn't stay. The forest might be alive again with the call of the elephants, but it wasn't safe. Silas was dangerous, unpredictable. He turned swiftly, making his way toward the hidden path leading deeper into the forest. His every step was cautious, calculated. The weight of the moment hung heavy in his chest. He had been the one to teach the elephants how to find peace and safety in the wilderness. Now, it was up to him to ensure that peace endured, that no harm came to the creatures he had promised to protect. As Nathan moved deeper into the underbrush, the oppressive weight of the forest seemed to press in on him. The trees, thick and ancient, seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky, but they also felt suffocating, as though they were closing in on him. The path twisted and turned like the maze of his own thoughts. He couldn't hear the elephants anymore, couldn't feel their presence nearby. The silence felt wrong again, unsettling, as if the forest was holding its breath. Nathan's pace quickened. The further he went, the more isolated he became. The air was thick with tension, charged with something he couldn't place, a faint rustle, a shadow in his periphery. He wasn't alone. He stopped dead in his tracks, listening carefully. The subtle sound of leaves crunching underfoot, a slow, deliberate movement. It wasn't Silas, it wasn't the elephants. His pulse spiked. A low, familiar rumble rippled through the air. It was an elephant call, but it wasn't. Nathan's stomach turned. It was a different sound, one filled with distress. He recognized the call. It was Layla, the calf he had saved. His heart skipped a beat as he pushed forward, panic seizing his chest. He could feel the ground trembling beneath his feet as he neared the clearing where he had last seen the herd. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of wet leaves and the sharp tang of fear. And then, as he stepped into the clearing, he saw it. The herd was gone. The ground was littered with broken branches, trampled leaves, and the dark stains of fresh soil disturbed by heavy footprints. But the most unsettling thing of all was the faint, high-pitched whimper that floated on the air. Leela. Nathan's eyes scanned the clearing, his breath shallow as he moved forward cautiously, as if each step could trigger an eruption of danger. The air was thick with the scent of fear now, both animal and human. Suddenly, through the thick underbrush, he saw her. Layla lay on the ground, her legs twitching, her trunk curled tightly around herself, trying desperately to rise. Her eyes were wide with panic, and the skin around her body was coated in sweat. The calf was alone. Abandoned? Hurt? Nathan's heart sank. How could this have happened? The herd was supposed to protect her. They were supposed to stay together. But something had torn them apart. The poacher's hand was too close, too dangerous. He crouched low, taking slow, measured steps toward the calf, trying to calm her without making any sudden movements. Layla's body jerked again, her trunk writhing in confusion, seeking comfort, but her fear was palpable. Nathan extended his hand, speaking in the language only an elephant could understand. His fingers brushed through the air, moving in deliberate, slow gestures that meant safety, assurance. He was the one who had raised her. He was the one who had taught her how to trust. But Layla's panic was growing. The calf's ears flared as a distant sound caught her attention. Nathan turned toward the rustling, the faint crack of a branch underfoot, a familiar, malevolent presence. Silas. Before Nathan could react, he heard a quick movement from behind him, a shift in the air that didn't belong. A shadow crossed his vision, a flash of movement, quick and silent, like a snake ready to strike. His breath caught. The poacher had circled around him. He had been waiting, watching. Nathan didn't have time to think. He turned swiftly, his feet digging into the dirt as he placed himself between Layla and the approaching threat. His heart thudded in his chest. the space between him and Silas closing with each passing second. He could feel the poacher's eyes on him, cold, calculating. Nathan had no weapon, no means of defense other than his connection to the wilderness, to the elephants. But now, he wasn't sure that was enough. And then, a single moment changed everything. The ground shook, the trees above creaked as a thunderous sound split the air. A low, mighty call rose from the depths of the forest, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. It was Amara, the matriarch of the herd. Silas froze, his eyes widened, disbelief flickering across his face, as the forest around him came alive once more. A massive shadow loomed behind Nathan. The herd had returned. The elephants emerged from the tree line, their enormous bodies moving with the grace of creatures who had known the earth for centuries. Amara, leading them, her eyes locked onto Silas with a kind of ancient fury, her trunk curled, poised for action. The other elephants flanked her, ready to defend their own. Nathan, his breath catching in his throat, stood frozen as the herd surrounded him, creating an unbreakable barrier between Silas and the vulnerable calf. The poacher, now utterly outmatched, took a hesitant step back. The matriarch's gaze did not waver from him. Silas could feel the raw power in the air, the living, breathing force of the elephants, and for the first time, he looked afraid. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply turned and with slow, deliberate steps began to retreat into the wilderness, disappearing into the shadows from which he had come. Nathan watched him go, his heart still racing but his breath slowly steadying. The herd remained with him, Amara's gaze softening as she stepped toward Layla, guiding the calf to her feet with a gentle touch of her trunk. Layla, still trembling, took a few wobbly steps forward, following the comforting presence of the matriarch. Nathan stood for a long time, watching the herd, his mind swirling with the strange, unsettling realization that there was no victory in this battle. The forest had only grown more dangerous, and Silas would return. The peace of the sanctuary had been shattered, but the bond he shared with the elephants had been forged even deeper in that moment of crisis. The silence in the clearing was deafening, but it was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of survival, of resilience, of an unspoken promise that no matter what came next, the wild would always fight back. The elephants moved slowly, cautiously, as if they too understood that the battle wasn't over. Nathan followed them, every step a reminder that, for now, the wilderness had won. And he would be there, standing in the heart of it, to protect the creatures that had saved him, just as they had saved each other. As the elephants made their way through the thick underbrush, their powerful bodies moving with a careful but determined grace, Nathan stayed close behind. His every step seemed to echo in the silence left in Silas's wake, the poacher's presence now a mere shadow. The calm that followed the confrontation felt fragile, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if the peace would last. Layla walked between Amara and a young bull named Juma, the latter keeping a protective distance around her, his ears still flared in alertness. Amara, the matriarch, glanced back at Nathan, her eyes steady but not without a flicker of concern. Nathan could feel the weight of that gaze, a quiet reminder that while the herd had endured the worst, the forest was still filled with dangers that no one could predict. They moved slowly, carefully, as if wary of any more disruptions. Nathan had been in the forest long enough to know that there were no guarantees when it came to survival. For years he had worked alongside the elephants, teaching them, learning from them, but there was always an undercurrent of uncertainty in the wild. The moment Silas had appeared, it had become clear just how fragile the balance was. The group moved toward a familiar, quiet part of the sanctuary, a small river that wound through the trees like a lifeline. The water was clear and fresh here, and the vegetation thick, offering shelter from the heat of the day. It had been the herd's favorite spot, until today. Now it felt more like a refuge, a sanctuary in its truest sense, where the calm could settle and the tension could ease. Nathan stopped just at the edge of the clearing, watching the elephants drink from the river's edge. Amara led the way, her strong, graceful trunk reaching for the water, while the others followed her closely, the rhythm of their movements synchronized. Leela, still tentative, drank from the shallows, her trunk trembling slightly as if she hadn't quite shaken off the fear that had gripped her moments before. Nathan let out a slow breath. The air had a sense of coolness now, the kind of quiet that followed after a storm. It was a moment of peace, but he knew it wouldn't last long. Silas was gone for now, but the danger was always lurking, always waiting for the slightest misstep. He couldn't afford to let his guard down,